Tonight we're diving into one of the most underestimated champions of the ancient world, Homo erectus. Not flashy, not famous, and definitely not as meme-worthy as their cousins, but if human evolution had a silent MVP, it was them. These folks didn't just survive the chaos of prehistoric Earth, they conquered it with grit, fire, and a stubborn refusal to quit. While others faded, Homo erectus marched, adapted, spread across continents, and basically invented the long-haul hustle. They weren't the brainiest or the strongest, but they were the ones who said, "We'll figure it out," and then actually did. So before we load up the mental time machine and start this evolutionary field trip, take a second to like the video, but only if you really mean it, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what weird hour it is where you live. I love seeing that global chaos. Now settle in, get cozy. Maybe crack a window for that cool evening breeze, and let's unravel the story of the ancient trailblazers who walked so the rest of us could run. Literally. Step back in time. No cities, no roads, no phones. Just volcanic plains, shifting climates, and predators around every corner. It's roughly 1.6 million years ago, and somewhere between modern Kenya and the fringes of Southeast Asia, a new kind of hominin is emerging. Not quite human, but, oh, they're getting close. Their name? Homo erectus, Latin for upright man, but they should have been called the get-it-done species. These weren't fragile thinkers or slow adapters. These were the all-terrain survivalists of the Pleistocene, built not just to survive, but to move, spread, and dominate. Unlike their more famous relatives, Homo erectus didn't rely on brute strength or flashy tools. They weren't the intellectual powerhouses of prehistory, but they didn't need to be. What they had was endurance, biological, psychological, and maybe even spiritual. They were the first to truly walk out of Africa, not as wanderers, but as colonizers of a wild, dangerous Earth. And they didn't just dabble. They set up shop across Asia, Europe, and possibly even made it to island chains that would terrify modern campers. We're talking journeys that would make your smartwatch explode. Physically, they looked familiar, but with their own flavor. Around 5'10" on average, lean but robust, with long legs and a barrel-shaped torso designed for long-distance travel. They weren't sprinters. They were marathoners with a mission. Their skulls were thick, their jaws strong, and their foreheads, well, kind of absent. But that dome housed a brain approaching 950 to 1,100 cubic centimeters, about 2/3 of ours. That may not sound like much, but for their time, that was Ferrari-level processing power compared to what came before. Their faces were strong, not delicate. Large brow ridges shaded eyes that scanned the savannah for threats or opportunity. Their noses were wide, possibly to help humidify dry air in arid environments. And that jaw, built like a vice, perfect for chewing through a diet that included raw meat, fibrous plants, and whatever else they could get their hands on, because cooking was still an experimental concept. These weren't picky eaters, they were practical ones. But the real magic of Homo erectus wasn't in their bones, it was in their mindset. They were curious, relentless, and surprisingly crafty. Archaeologists have uncovered campsites with evidence of repeated use, meaning they weren't just wandering aimlessly, they had routines. They came back to good hunting grounds. They organized their living spaces. They learned from their environment and adapted over time. That's not animal instinct. That's early culture. One of the most revolutionary things about them, fire. Not just stumbling upon it during a lightning storm and running away screaming, they used it. Evidence from caves like Wonderwerk in South Africa, dating back nearly 1 million years, shows controlled use of fire. Charred bones, ash layers, and burnt stones all pointing to deliberate, repeated fire usage. This changed everything. It gave warmth, protection, and cooked food, which made calories easier to absorb and nutrition more efficient. It was the first technological upgrade in human history, and it came courtesy of these quiet innovators. And then there's the tools. Now, Homo erectus didn't create laser-etched microblades, but they weren't slamming rocks together randomly either. Enter the Acheulean hand axe, arguably the first true multi-tool. Symmetrical, sharpened, and produced with an eye for consistency, these tools were crafted with care and used for everything: butchering, digging, breaking bones, and possibly even social signaling. If a tool could talk, these ones would say, "Yeah, I'm built different." But here's the kicker. Acheulean tools appear over and over again across thousands of kilometers and hundreds of thousands of years. From East Africa to northern China, from the Middle East to the Indonesian archipelago, the same basic tool, tweaked but recognizable. That's not just technology. That's shared knowledge. Some kind of information transmission had to be happening. Whether it was direct teaching, imitation, or just sheer observational brilliance, it meant Homo erectus wasn't just surviving. They were learning. They were teaching. That's a whisper of culture right there, echoing through the stone. And don't be fooled into thinking they were just grunting loners. Fossils show signs of long-term injuries, broken limbs that had healed, worn teeth that suggest others helped chew food for elders. This wasn't a species that left the weak behind. It was a community. Maybe not with complex language, but certainly with cooperation. Somewhere in a primitive campfire glow, one Homo erectus probably handed another a piece of cooked meat and said, in whatever sound passed for words, "You're not alone." They weren't flashy, they weren't famous, but their legacy runs deep. Without Homo erectus, there is no us. They set the path. They proved it could be done. They showed that the world could be conquered with endurance, innovation, and just a spark of fire in the dark. Now imagine this. You're standing in what will one day become Georgia, not the US state, but the stretch of land between Eastern Europe and Western Asia, and the year is somewhere around 1.8 million years ago. A group of Homo erectus individuals walks past you, not just surviving but thriving in terrain that would challenge even modern hikers. They've come a long way, not metaphorically but literally, from their East African origins, and they're not done moving yet. These early humans would go on to become the first global explorers, crossing deserts, braving highlands, wading through rivers, and venturing into unfamiliar territories with no maps, no gear, and no backup. They did it with nothing but determination, durable feet, and a fire-lit sense of purpose. This was no accidental stroll into new lands. This was wave after wave of expansion, spanning tens of thousands of generations. These weren't short-term camping trips. This was humanity's first great migration, and the reason they pulled it off is surprisingly simple: adaptability. Homo erectus wasn't built for one environment. They were generalists in the best way. In tropical forests, they learned to harvest fruits and ambush monkeys. In arid grasslands, they scavenged meat from predator kills and dug for roots. In cold, open steppes, they bundled together around fires and hunted large game with teamwork and rudimentary tools. The diversity of their survival strategies is the ancient blueprint for everything Homo sapiens would later refine. They reached regions no previous hominin had dared enter. Fossils discovered in places like Java, in what is now Indonesia, suggest that Homo erectus made it across bodies of water long before boats were even a dream. They might not have had ships or sails, but they figured out how to cross small seas, likely clinging to natural rafts made from floating vegetation or debris. These weren't just landlubbers hugging the coast. These were strategic survivors who saw an island and thought, "Let's go there and see what's good." That willingness to explore put them in places where even today, the environment is brutal. Take the Zhoukoudian cave site near modern-day Beijing. This isn't just a dusty dig spot. It's a multi-layered time capsule showing us Homo erectus living through seasons, storing tools, preparing food, and leaving behind a legacy buried in ash. Fire pits, burnt bones, scattered stone flakes. This wasn't just passing through, they made a home there. They weathered winters that modern humans would curse, and still had enough energy to invent new ways to sharpen a rock. Think about that. They weren't just enduring the cold, they were mastering it. The expansion of Homo erectus wasn't without challenges. Predators were everywhere: saber-toothed cats, massive hyenas, and towering terror birds in some regions. Each new ecosystem came with different threats and opportunities, and instead of running from change, they ran toward it. Their ability to adapt wasn't magic. It was hard-earned through trial and error, through generations watching the sky, reading animal tracks and figuring out how to make a tool that didn't break the second time you used it. And this leads us to one of the most underrated aspects of their legacy: planning. You don't survive in multiple continents by luck. You plan. You observe. You anticipate. This isn't the behavior of a dull brute dragging a club around. This is the strategic mind of an ancient innovator, figuring out migration routes, recognizing seasonal changes, and preparing food stores before winter hit. When they hunted, they weren't always alone. Evidence suggests coordinated group behavior, surrounding prey, driving animals into traps, using terrain to their advantage. They were using their environment like a tactical map, long before anyone knew how to draw one. But this kind of expansion took a toll. As they moved further from Africa, their populations grew more isolated. That meant slower gene flow, more local adaptation, and eventually different regional variations began to appear. The Homo erectus living in Dmanisi, an ancient town in what is now Georgia, looked different from those in China or Indonesia. Some were smaller, some were more robust, some had slightly different tool styles. But despite those differences, they were all branches of the same tough, mobile family tree. And that's a key lesson here. Diversity didn't weaken them, it made them stronger. Their migration also influenced the evolution of later species. It's believed that groups of Homo erectus gave rise to Homo heidelbergensis in Europe and Africa, which in turn led to Neanderthals, Denisovans, and eventually U.S. Homo sapiens. Without Homo erectus paving the roads, laying the mental groundwork, and teaching the value of forward momentum, there is no next chapter in the human story. They didn't know it at the time, but they were the ones handing the baton forward, generation after generation, across rivers, mountains, and savannas. Now let's not romanticize this too much. Life was still brutal. Injury and disease were common, childbirth was dangerous, life expectancy was short. Most didn't make it past their 30s, if that. But what's astonishing is that they endured these hardships not just once, but for well over 1.5 million years. That's not a typo. That's longer than every civilization in human history combined. They weren't a footnote in evolution. They were the headline for longer than we've been writing headlines. And what kind of culture did they develop during that time? While we don't have murals or music left behind, we have something just as powerful: consistency. The Acheulean hand axe lasted for nearly 1 million years, passed down from one generation to the next like a sacred craft. You don't replicate something that long unless it works. But more importantly, you don't replicate something unless you remember it, teach it, and value it. That's tradition. That's memory. That's the first flicker of civilization. Their tools were found near large animal remains, suggesting complex butchering and possibly even meat preservation techniques. They probably used hides for warmth, though we've yet to find clear evidence of clothing. But we know they weren't just reacting to their world, they were shaping it. Over time, they likely developed social hierarchies, basic communication systems, and even regional dialects of sound and gesture. These weren't wild animals. They were early people, looking up at the stars and wondering, just like we do, what comes next. The irony is that the farther they traveled, the more forgotten they became. Their bones lie beneath our feet in places far from their homeland, their tools buried under layers of earth and time. But their story is still whispering through the flint shards and burn marks. A story not of kings or conquests, but of persistence, of walking farther than anyone else dared, of building fire in strange lands, and of choosing progress over comfort. Let's talk about the real game changer. Not muscles, not tools, not even migration. Fire. The moment Homo erectus figured out how to harness flame, the rules of survival changed forever. It wasn't just about staying warm anymore. Fire meant security, it meant community, and it meant power over a world that had never known mercy. Picture a quiet night on the plains of ancient Ethiopia. The air's cold. Predators lurk just outside the glow. But there, in a tight circle of figures, flames dance on stone, meat sizzles, shadows flicker, and for the first time in Earth's long, cold history, The dark is no longer in control. The mastery of fire wasn't an overnight miracle. It started small. Maybe they first saw lightning strike a tree, watched it burn and realized it scared away lions. Or maybe a branch caught fire in a volcanic region and sparked curiosity instead of panic. Over generations, they learned to control it. Not create it from nothing at first, but preserve it, transport it, protect it. They carried embers and hollowed-out bark, kept watch over it like a sacred flame, and learned to feed it like a living creature. Eventually, they discovered ways to spark it themselves, striking stones like flint and iron-rich minerals to create sparks, nestling dry grasses or leaves underneath like nature's kindling. The day fire obeyed them, the world got smaller, and their possibilities grew exponentially. What did fire unlock for them? First and foremost, better food. Raw meat is tough, dangerous, and full of parasites. Cooked meat is tender, safer, and more nutrient-rich. This meant they could eat more types of food, digest it more easily, and feed more people with less energy spent chewing for hours. Cooked food doesn't just fill your belly, it fuels your brain. Some scientists even argue that the caloric gains from cooking allowed their brains to grow and maintain more energy-demanding neural activity. Fire, in a very real way, fed evolution itself. But beyond nutrition, fire built the first true sense of home. It created a center, a place people returned to. A campfire wasn't just for warmth. It was the ancient world's first hearth, a point of gathering, storytelling, safety, and shared labor. It was probably around those early fires that social bonds were strengthened, cooperation emerged, and the first sparks of culture flared to life. You can imagine small groups huddled around a blaze, trading sounds and gestures, possibly the earliest forms of language, laughing, planning, mourning, not because they read about it, but because survival demanded connection. And around that fire, they found it. Fire also provided security in a brutal world. Nothing terrifies a predator quite like something unpredictable and hot. Smoke and flame kept hyenas, lions, and other nocturnal hunters at bay. This allowed Homo erectus to rest more safely through the night. And rest is no small thing. Rest means recovery. It means dreams, memories, and perhaps the first flickers of imagination. The ability to visualize more than just what is, but what could be. Fire, in essence, gave them time, and time gave birth to thought. The presence of fire also meant adaptation to colder climates. No longer limited to tropical zones, these early humans began moving into temperate regions that would have killed less equipped species. They could warm their bodies, dry their clothing, and even heat water if they figured it out. That's not just surviving, that's customizing nature to suit your needs. And for a species that started out as vulnerable prey, that's a psychological leap as well as a practical one. It meant they weren't always reacting to the world. Sometimes they were preparing for it. That mental shift, from passive to proactive, echoes across every human achievement since. Now let's shift gears slightly, because while fire was a revolution, food still remained a full-time job. Hunting and gathering weren't hobbies, they were life itself. And Homo erectus developed some of the earliest methods of coordinated hunting. We're not talking about lone wolves charging blindly. These were calculated movements designed to trap prey, corral it, and finish the job as efficiently as possible. The tools were simple: stone axes, sharpened spears, sometimes wooden clubs. But the strategy was sophisticated. Fossil sites show butchered bones alongside stone tools, suggesting that they processed meat right there, carefully and with purpose. They didn't waste. Bones were cracked open for marrow, hides likely stripped for insulation, tendons possibly used as cordage. This wasn't mindless consumption. It was organized, methodical resource use. And again, this points to planning, memory, and division of labor. Perhaps one group handled the kill while others stayed back with the fire, preparing camp or guarding the young. It's not hard to imagine roles beginning to form, not rigid jobs, but early prototypes. A tracker, a cutter, a firekeeper, a lookout, a provider. These weren't just instincts, these were choices, habits, traditions in the making. What's more fascinating is the evidence of food sharing. In a world where calories meant survival, the act of giving food to others, especially to those injured, elderly, or too young to hunt, tells us something crucial. Compassion was already part of the equation. Sharing food is not only a gesture of kindness, it's an investment in the group's survival. The injured today might be the protectors tomorrow. The young fed today might be the hunters of the next decade. And so, by feeding others, they were feeding their own future. And don't overlook the psychological impact of these behaviors. The more they gathered around fires, shared meals, and cooperated on tasks, the more tightly their groups likely bonded. This would have elevated social cohesion and even led to early forms of empathy, caring for the sick, helping the injured heal. These weren't just nice gestures. They were strategies that gave the group a better chance of making it through tough times. Fossilized remains of Homo erectus with healed injuries, limbs that had clearly been broken and mended, suggest these early humans didn't leave their wounded to die. They waited. They helped. They adapted their routines to care for others. And that, right there, is the quiet heartbeat of humanity. The idea that survival isn't just a solo pursuit, that we do better together than apart. That cooperation isn't weakness, it's strategy. Long before civilization, cities, or even language as we know it, Homo erectus was already building the foundations of human connection around simple things: warmth, food, protection, and community. They weren't perfect. They weren't immortal. But they planted the seeds of what would one day become love, loyalty, and leadership. This age of fire and food marked more than just survival. It marked the beginning of identity, the start of self-awareness, maybe even the first time someone looked across the firelight, saw someone else's face reflected in the flickering orange glow, and felt something beyond instinct, something like belonging. It's tempting to look back at Homo erectus and think of them as rough prototypes, halfway between ape and human, somewhere in the evolutionary waiting room before the real show started. But that view is not just inaccurate, it's unfair. Because buried beneath layers of time and sediment lies a much richer, more intricate truth. Homo erectus wasn't a rough draft. They were a fully realized, remarkably capable species whose intelligence may not have screamed through cave art or language, but whispered through survival, adaptation, and quiet innovation. They weren't writing poetry, but they were rewriting what it meant to be alive. Their intelligence didn't manifest in the flashy ways modern humans tend to romanticize. There were no pyramids or epic sagas. But what they did have was consistency. Their tools, the famous Acheulean hand axes and cleavers, weren't just flukes of chipped stone. They were refined across generations, passed down with precision and purpose. These weren't one-off inventions. They were part of a collective memory, evidence of a mind capable of more than reaction, a mind capable of repetition, iteration, and intentional design. Imagine a young Homo erectus watching an elder shape a tool by flaking stone at just the right angle, learning not by words but by mimicry, trial, and intuition. That's not mindless, that's mastery. And tool-making, even at its most basic, requires a lot from the brain. It demands spatial awareness and understanding of material properties and, above all, patience. You have to predict how the stone will fracture. You have to visualize the final shape while it's still buried in a block of unbroken rock. That's not something a random swing can accomplish. It's cognitive planning, the kind that modern engineers would recognize. When researchers replicate Acheulean techniques today, they don't describe it as brute force. They describe it as craftsmanship, which means Homo erectus wasn't just strong, they were subtle. But their intelligence went beyond tools. It showed up in how they moved, how they lived, and how they adapted. The migration patterns alone are a testament to logistical understanding. You don't spread across continents without noticing landmarks, memorizing routes, or understanding basic geography, even without maps. They knew where to find water, how to follow game trails, how to build shelters, and how to return to fruitful areas. That suggests an internal sense of place, of territory, of routine, of home. And all without GPS or language in the modern sense, just raw awareness and memory encoded in motion. Speaking of language, did they have it? Not as we know it, no. But silence doesn't mean stupidity. Fossils show that Homo erectus had vocal tracts capable of producing varied sounds, and they possessed the hyoid bone, an anchor point crucial for speech. Combine that with their increasing brain size and social complexity, and it's very likely they used proto-language, a system of sounds, gestures, expressions, maybe even rhythm, to communicate. Imagine a warning cry for danger, a grunt to indicate direction, a hum to calm a child, a call to gather. These weren't Shakespearean soliloquies, but they were functional, emotional, and shared. And emotional intelligence? That's where things get especially interesting. Consider the case of Turkana Boy, an adolescent Homo erectus discovered near Lake Turkana in Kenya. His nearly complete skeleton dates back over 1.5 million years and shows not only remarkable physical development, but also signs of congenital issues, spinal deformities, possible growth delays. Yet he survived well into his teenage years. That survival tells a story. Someone cared for him. Someone slowed down to accommodate him, perhaps brought him food, protected him from predators, included him despite his limitations. That's not biology. That's empathy. And empathy is intelligence wearing its softest armor. Empathy also appears in burial behaviors. While Homo erectus didn't leave behind formal graves in the way later species did, there are clues that they recognized death as more than just absence. Bodies were sometimes placed deliberately, not simply discarded. Items, stones, tools, maybe even food, were occasionally found near skeletal remains. We can't say for certain what they believed, but these gestures suggest awareness, an understanding that life had weight and that its end meant something more than just emptiness. Even without spiritual language, they may have begun to ask the first unspoken questions about what lies beyond. Their brain size hovered around 1,000 cubic centimeters, bigger than any hominin that came before, and not that far from ours. But size alone doesn't determine intellect. What matters is how that brain was wired. Homo erectus seemed to excel in visual and motor processing, which makes sense considering the challenges of their environment. Hunting, tool-making, navigating landscapes. These demand acute coordination and perception. Their brains were optimized for doing, for sensing, for surviving in a physical world that offered no second chances. They were real-time thinkers, not abstract philosophers, and that grounded intelligence is often overlooked in favor of more romanticized cerebral traits. Let's not forget their use of space. Some of the sites attributed to Homo erectus show a kind of zoning, areas for tool production, for butchering animals, for resting or shelter. That's not accidental. That's design. That's early architecture in its most rudimentary form, not with bricks or beams, but with understanding, with awareness of flow, safety, and efficiency. They were organizing their environment, manipulating it for convenience, for survival, and maybe even for comfort. When a group sits together in a circle, placing fire at the center, using rocks as makeshift seats and organizing tasks by who's good at what, that's culture being born. And culture doesn't require cities. It starts with repetition, with memory, with values passed not through writing but through presence. Maybe one individual was especially good at shaping stone. Others watched, learned, and followed. Maybe one had a knack for finding water. Their knowledge became vital, respected. These were roles, not professions. But they were the roots of community structure. They laid the groundwork for leadership, mentorship, even teaching. A child watching their parent work, mimicking those movements with their own little rock. That's education. That's knowledge transferring across generations. They may not have had myths or songs that we can decipher, but they had rhythm in their steps, purpose in their movements, and legacy in their hands. Every time they struck flint, every time they cooked food, every time they traveled a familiar path through unfamiliar terrain, they were writing history, not with ink, but with impact. And that quiet intelligence, that understated brilliance deserves more than a footnote. It deserves recognition. So when we think about what intelligence really means, not just IQ scores or linguistic flair, but the ability to solve problems, adapt, care, remember, and create, we must look again at Homo erectus. They were the thinkers who didn't write, the planners who didn't draw, the leaders who didn't speak in sentences, but still shaped the world. Their genius was in action, in durability, in presence. And maybe that's the kind of intelligence we could all learn from, especially now. Let's not mistake the enduring brilliance of Homo erectus for ease. Their lives, for all the innovation and adaptability, were still steeped in relentless physical challenge. This wasn't a species that flourished in comfort. They thrived in the crucible of necessity, where every choice, every movement, and every breath had weight. And within that harsh, unforgiving backdrop, their resilience took on mythic proportions. These were beings who didn't just learn how to survive. They turned survival into an art form. Where modern humans wince at a paper cut, Homo erectus walked for miles on torn feet, carrying sharp stones and slabs of meat across jagged plains under the glare of an unrelenting sun. The fossil record tells a story of impact: healed fractures, worn joints, teeth ground down to their roots. Their bodies were journals, pages written in pain and persistence. One particularly striking example comes from Java, Indonesia, where the remains of an individual show signs of chronic hip injury, the kind that would have made walking slow and painful. And yet the injury had healed over time, meaning this person lived for years after the trauma, which means someone had their back. Someone shared food, offered protection, slowed the pace for them. That kind of mutual care wasn't accidental. It was systemic, embedded in how they operated. This wasn't just resilience of the body. It was resilience of the group. And that group resilience was constantly being tested. The environments Homo erectus entered weren't just varied. They were volatile. Picture the landscapes: thick forests teeming with unseen dangers, open savannas where predators roamed in packs, cold highlands where the wind could flay exposed skin. These humans didn't adapt to a single climate. They conquered dozens. Each migration forced them to change their strategies. In wetter zones, they focused more on foraging, digging for tubers and gathering fruit. In colder, drier climates, they pivoted to more protein-heavy diets, stalking prey with stone-tipped spears and well-coordinated ambushes. Their hunting methods deserve special attention. Unlike later hominins who mastered long-range weaponry, Homo erectus often relied on close-quarters confrontations with dangerous game. These weren't tactical snipers, they were hand-to-hand survivalists. Fossils of large prey animals, elephants, buffalo, even early rhinoceroses, have been found alongside Acheulean tools, their bones marked with deliberate cuts. Now imagine approaching 1,000-pound beast armed with little more than sharpened stone and a nerve forged in desperation. That wasn't a fluke. That was organized risk-taking. It suggests not only courage, but communication. Some must have distracted the prey. Others lunged in to land the blow. The entire effort would have required timing, coordination, and mutual trust, the building blocks of any functioning team. But hunting wasn't the only risk. Just staying alive required constant vigilance. Diseases swept through groups with no understanding of hygiene. Infections could start from a single cut. Storms could flood temporary camps. Drought could empty rivers and scatter prey. Every member of the group had to pull their weight. And that's where social structure starts to become visible. Not in hierarchies or thrones, but in roles that emerged from necessity. Some were likely faster, some stronger, some better at spotting danger. Others might have been especially skilled at shaping tools or remembering migration paths. These weren't assigned titles, more like emergent specialties. Evolution didn't wait for job descriptions. It rewarded competence and cohesion. And cohesion meant more than just physical cooperation. It meant emotional bandwidth. When we talk about survival, we often focus on food and shelter. But morale, that's what gets you through the bad days. A moment of shared laughter, a gesture of reassurance, a silent acknowledgement of fear, loss, or relief. These are the things that hold a group together under strain. And while we'll never know exactly how Homo erectus expressed these things, the fact that they endured for so long, across so many terrains, suggests they had ways, Maybe rhythmic gestures, maybe tones in their vocalizations, maybe even symbolic movements, to convey something deeper than instinct, something human. And then there's creativity, not in the artistic sense we often associate with our own species, but in problem-solving under pressure. Consider this. A group moves into a region with new prey species, tougher hides, denser bones. Their old tools aren't cutting it, literally. What do? They innovate. They test new angles, new materials, new flaking techniques. We see regional variation in Acheulean tools not because of random chance, but because different environments required different solutions. That's not coincidence. It's conscious adjustment. It's prehistoric R&D. And those who failed to adapt didn't leave fossils. Only the problem solvers made it through. Water management was another area where intelligence shined. In dry seasons, water holes became battlegrounds. Not just for humans, but for every species in the area. Securing access meant the difference between life and death. There's growing evidence that Homo erectus may have planned movements around seasonal water patterns, returning to known springs, and building temporary camps nearby. They may even have dug for water, using tools or hands to reach hidden moisture beneath dry creek beds. That kind of strategic movement shows foresight. They weren't just reacting to their surroundings. They were reading them like a map and adjusting accordingly. And that map included memory. Imagine retracing steps across hundreds of kilometers, recognizing a particular bend in a river or a tree that always drops fruit in the same month. Those are environmental cues, but the ability to connect them over time is what makes memory matter. When the group elders passed down these locations, not through speech but through movement, repetition, and perhaps gesture, they were preserving not just knowledge but wisdom. And that transfer of wisdom is the earliest form of education. Before books, before language, there was demonstration and recall. The old teaching the young, not with lectures, but with action. Even danger became a lesson. Fire wasn't always a friend. It could burn entire landscapes. But learning to control it rather than fear it was part of their growth. Predators were terrifying, but understanding their habits turned fear into strategy. Poisonous plants killed, but their absence in a group's foraging habits suggests they were identified and avoided, possibly through observational learning or caution passed down over time. Trial and error left marks, but those who survived carried the lessons forward. And through all of this, through the risk, the learning, the daily struggle, they didn't just endure, they formed a legacy. One built not on dominance, but on balance. Not on conquest, but on commitment. Homo erectus wasn't the loudest species. They didn't leave monuments, but they left footprints across the world, evidence that they were here, that they endured, and that they made the harshest places livable. That kind of quiet resilience doesn't fade. It echoes. It inspires. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that strength isn't always about power. Sometimes, strength is just persistence in motion. When we look at fossils, it's easy to get caught up in bones and tools, in measurements and muscle attachment points, in carbon dating and cranial capacity. But between the layers of ash and stone, there's another story, quieter, harder to measure, but far more human. It's the story of connection, of kinship, of what it meant to belong, to be cared for, to care for someone else. Homo erectus may not have written songs or carved names into walls, but they did something far more powerful. They built relationships. They forged bonds strong enough to withstand not just time, but trauma, distance, and death. And in those bonds, we glimpse the first true echoes of human culture. To understand their emotional world, we have to start with the family, not in the modern nuclear sense, but in the practical, fluid formation of survival-based groups. A mother, a child, an older sibling, perhaps a grandparent figure, not because of DNA testing, but because roles emerged from need. Mothers needed help, children needed protection, elders held knowledge. In these groups, everyone had value, not just because of what they could do, but because of who they were to the group. That kind of identity doesn't exist without attachment, without memory, without some form of recognition. They didn't just tolerate each other, they relied on each other. And reliance builds emotion. Evidence from sites like Dmanisi in modern-day Georgia reveals individuals with severe injuries or deformities who survived long after they would have perished alone. In one famous case, a nearly toothless adult was found among younger remains. They clearly couldn't chew meat or tough plant fibers, yet they lived. Someone must have fed them. Someone must have made the choice, again and again, to share soft food, to help them move, to let them rest near the fire, instead of pushing them out to fend for themselves. That choice wasn't based on productivity. It was based on presence, on love, in its most ancient, unspoken form. Now picture that scene. The group has gathered near a shallow cave, firelight bouncing off stone walls, children huddled close to their mothers, a few elders sitting slightly apart, sharpening tools or watching the horizon for threats. One older member winces as they shift, an old injury flaring up, and a younger one moves closer, offering support. No words, no thanks, just a quiet acknowledgement that pain shared is pain reduced. That's not instinct. That's empathy translated into action. And it's not a stretch to believe that gestures and expressions began to take on symbolic meaning in these groups. A hand signal might mean danger. A head tilt could indicate direction. A vocal tone might communicate comfort or warning. Over generations, these signals would become more nuanced, more complex. What begins as a grunt becomes a call. What begins as a call becomes rhythm, and rhythm, well, rhythm is the foundation of music. Not performance, but pattern. The beat of communication, the drum line of survival. From this communication comes cohesion. When a group knows how to read each other, not just physically, but emotionally, it becomes stronger, more responsive, better able to adapt in real time. And that social cohesion, over time, becomes culture. Not the kind defined by art or literature, but the kind you see in shared behaviors, repeated rituals, and communal identity. Homo erectus may have been the first species to begin developing cultural memory, a set of practices passed on not just because they worked, but because they felt right. Think about clothing. While we don't have direct fossil evidence of stitched garments from this period, it's entirely possible that hides and skins were used in increasingly deliberate ways, not just for warmth, but for identification. Maybe certain families wore specific furs, or elders carried unique objects that signaled their status or role. This would be the earliest whisper of style, of symbolic clothing, of wearable information. And once symbolism enters the picture, everything changes. Suddenly, a bone isn't just a tool, it's a story. A necklace isn't just decoration, it's a memory. That idea is supported by scattered finds of unusually shaped stones, shells, or animal parts gathered and kept by Homo erectus. Items that didn't serve an obvious purpose, too small for cutting, too fragile for hunting. So why keep them? Maybe they had meaning. Maybe a shell reminded someone of a successful crossing. Maybe a smooth stone represented a river they had survived. Maybe a claw from a predator was carried as a sign of personal strength. These aren't conclusions we can prove, but they're possibilities that feel grounded in everything else we know about them, that they felt, remembered, and honored experience. And speaking of memory, burial is one of the most profound ways humans have ever expressed care for the dead. While Homo erectus burials don't show the complexity of later rituals, there is increasing evidence that they didn't always leave their dead to rot where they fell. Some bodies appear to have been moved, placed deliberately in protected areas. The ground may have been cleared, rocks arranged. Again, no flowery offerings or carved tombstones, but a gesture nonetheless. One that says, "This person mattered." That gesture is the embryo of grief, of tribute, of the idea that life extends beyond breath. What's more, the time spent in such acts indicates they had room in their minds, and in their social structure, for more than just survival. They had time to pause, to reflect, to care, and to pass that mindset on to others. When a group stops to mourn or remember, it means they're looking backward. But when they teach that to their young, they're also looking forward. That double vision, past and future, death and legacy, is the core of human consciousness. And Homo erectus was right on the threshold. So what does this tell us? That culture doesn't begin with cave paintings or stone monuments. It begins with how we treat each other, with how we remember the injured, with how we value the elderly, with how we include those who can't contribute but still belong. It begins with emotion, not as a weakness but as a strategy, because a group that loves each other, even imperfectly, will survive longer than one that doesn't. And Homo erectus, for all their ruggedness and silence, may have loved deeply. Their legacy, then, is not just in stone tools or migration routes. It's in that first comforting touch, that first shared meal, that first decision to carry someone who couldn't walk. In those moments, a species steps out of pure instinct and into meaning. And meaning, even without words, is the birthplace of humanity. As the winds of time swept across the continents and climates shifted with ruthless indifference, Homo erectus endured. But eventually, even the hardiest species meet their limits. One by one, the known populations of Homo erectus vanished from the fossil record, not in a single dramatic event, but in slow, regional disappearances. Climate shifts, competition from emerging species, dwindling resources, and fragmented migration routes all played a role. But while their physical presence faded, their impact did not. If you trace the lineage of the human story, not just biologically but behaviorally, it leads back to them. Their footprints are the first on the path. Their ideas, primitive though they may seem now, were the seeds from which complexity would bloom. Let's look at the evolutionary line. From Homo erectus came a cascade of new species, each carrying a fragment of that ancient blueprint. In Africa, populations likely evolved into Homo heidelbergensis, a robust species that would eventually give rise to both Homo sapiens, us, and Homo neanderthalensis, our Ice Age cousins. Meanwhile, in Asia, isolated groups of Homo erectus may have evolved into unique offshoots like Homo floresiensis, the so-called hobbits of Indonesia, and other still mysterious archaic humans found in recent decades. These branches weren't mistakes, they were experiments, variations written into the DNA of endurance. And at the root of them all stands Homo erectus, not as an ancestor in the shadows, but as a bold pioneer who faced a hostile world and dared to move forward anyway. What's astonishing is how much of their behavior remains visible, reflected in what we now consider basic human practices. The hand axe, perfected by Homo erectus over hundreds of thousands of years, represents not just a tool, but a mindset. Make things better, make them last, make them teachable. That legacy continues in every screwdriver, every kitchen knife, every carefully shaped instrument that turns intention into action. When you hold a well-balanced tool, you're holding the descendant of an idea that predates cities, writing, and almost everything we define as civilization. But it wasn't just about tools. Their impact runs deeper. Homo erectus was likely the first hominin to understand time as something longer than the moment. Their repeated seasonal migrations, their return to familiar campsites, their burial of the dead, all these acts suggest a concept of past and future. They didn't just live, they planned. They didn't just react, they remembered. And memory, once it takes root in a species, changes everything. It lays the foundation for identity, for language, for generational knowledge. In that sense, every school, every story, every monument to history, they all carry an echo of Homo erectus. Even the way they spread across the globe set a precedent for our own species. Before Homo sapiens ever dared to cross mountains or oceans, Homo erectus had already done it. Their bones have been found in regions we once believed too remote, too difficult, too far from the evolutionary core. And yet there they were, not lost, but learning. Every successful migration by modern humans was made easier by the paths they blazed. Every fire we built in foreign soil was kindled by the courage they demonstrated. They didn't conquer the world with weapons or walls. They walked it one footprint at a time with patience and purpose. And let's not overlook their physical influence. While modern humans are more graceful, thinner-boned, lighter-framed, some of us still carry echoes of that ancient sturdiness. Broad jaws, deep-set eyes, barrel-shaped rib cages. There are people today whose skeletal features would not look out of place in an Erectus clan. More interestingly, our internal systems, the way we metabolize food, regulate body heat, or endure physical labor, carry traits likely optimized during the long reign of Homo erectus. Even though we look different, our engines were built on blueprints first refined during their era. In terms of cognition, the implications are profound. We often take for granted the way our minds work: pattern recognition, cause and effect logic, simple abstract reasoning. But these aren't divine gifts. They're inherited abilities, gradually honed through endless repetitions of practical thought. Imagine a Homo erectus individual watching clouds gather, noticing that animals behave differently before a storm, predicting rain, and adjusting their plans accordingly. That's environmental intelligence. It's not symbolic, but it's strategic. And from those early moments of cause and effect, of seeing, understanding, and applying, came the roots of science, engineering, and all structured thought. They also left behind something more intangible, a template for how humans might live together. Not in isolation, not in selfish competition, but in groups where knowledge is shared, roles are respected, and survival is a collective achievement. Their social structures, though invisible now, were real and functional. They set the tone for everything that followed, from family units to tribal alliances to the cities and nations we know today. We didn't invent social order, we inherited it, refined it, expanded it. But the template, the idea that we are better when we collaborate, that belonged to Homo erectus. And yet, for all they gave us, they remain relatively obscure. They don't get the cinematic treatment that Neanderthals do. Their name doesn't spark instant recognition the way Homo sapiens does. They were never flashy, never dominant in the cultural imagination. Maybe that's because they didn't leave behind grand symbols. No painted caves, no buried treasure. Just the quiet, undeniable fact that they lasted longer than almost any other human species. For over 1.5 million years, they adapted, migrated, learned, survived. No wars, no empires. Just the raw, persistent brilliance of staying alive and staying together through everything the planet could throw at them. So how should we remember them? Not as an old version of us, but as something that stood fully on its own. As a species that didn't need monuments to matter. As a people who found meaning in movement, connection, and craft. Their story isn't one of extinction. It's one of contribution, of foundation, of quiet excellence. And though their bones have turned to dust, their legacy lives in every path we take, every fire we build, every time we look at a piece of stone and think, what can I make with this? The next time you solve a problem, share a skill, or take care of someone in need, remember, you're doing something very old. Older than agriculture, older than writing, older than even the idea of human. You're walking in the footsteps of Homo erectus, and those steps still lead forward. For a species that thrived for well over 1.5 million years, it was inevitable that Homo erectus would one day meet others who were also rising through the evolutionary ranks. The ancient world wasn't a neat progression of one species replacing another like actors stepping off stage. It was a tangled, overlapping theater of hominins, each adapted to different environments, each experimenting with survival in their own way. There were Neanderthals stalking mammoths in the frosty hills of Eurasia. There were Denisovans hiding in high-altitude caves. There were early Homo sapiens beginning to stir along the grasslands of eastern Africa. And in the middle of that evolutionary mosaic was Homo erectus, still walking, still enduring, still shaping the land beneath their feet. They weren't obsolete. They were surrounded. These cross-species encounters are not the stuff of ancient folklore. They're written into the genome. Genetic evidence confirms that interbreeding occurred between different hominin species multiple times across different regions. While direct genetic traces of Homo erectus are harder to isolate than those of Neanderthals or Denisovans, it's likely that in the long timeline of human mingling, their DNA flowed into the larger river that shaped our modern form. After all, they were everywhere, from the river valleys of Indonesia to the sun-baked expanses of eastern Africa. They had the numbers, the presence, and the opportunity. What happens when species meet? It's not always war. Sometimes it's competition, other times cooperation, and sometimes it's something far more intimate. Migration paths may have overlapped. Watering holes might have been shared. And when two groups met under neutral conditions, whether over a carcass, a cave, or simple curiosity, interactions occurred. There might have been tension, maybe violence, but there might also have been trade, mimicry, or alliance. Perhaps a tool was copied. Perhaps a fire-starting technique was exchanged without words. Or perhaps, one night, two beings from different species looked at each other not as threats, but as possibilities. It's in those moments that evolution gets creative. But these interactions weren't always balanced. Homo sapiens, with their more complex languages, symbolic thinking, and increasingly abstract cognition, began to dominate the behavioral playing field. Over time, they refined the things Homo erectus had pioneered. Their tools became more diverse, their shelters more complex, their communities larger, more stratified, more intricate. They built myths, mapped stars, and imagined futures that didn't yet exist. And while they owed much to their predecessors, their rise spelled the decline of older species, not through deliberate extermination, but through the slow, grinding wheel of adaptation. In a world of fast change and fierce selection, innovation is everything. And eventually Homo sapiens innovated faster. That said, the extinction of Homo erectus wasn't a singular event. It was staggered, regional, a fading of light, one hearth at a time. Populations in Africa may have transitioned into other hominin forms around 500,000 years ago. Those in Central Asia held on longer. The last known group on the island of Java, Indonesia, survived until as recently as 108,000 years ago, long after Neanderthals had appeared and nearly 60,000 years after Homo sapiens had begun to walk upright in their own right. These final Erectus communities were holding out in isolation, in small self-contained ecosystems, protected by geography, but cut off from the broader exchange of innovation. They weren't so much defeated as outpaced, and yet, despite this gradual disappearance, their echoes remained. The Acheulean hand axe still appeared in toolkits long after their final bones had fossilized. Some of their hunting strategies lived on in hybrid populations. Even aspects of their physical strength, broad shoulders, thick bones, persisted in various later groups. Like the roots of a great tree buried beneath the soil, Homo erectus fed the growth of what came after. And occasionally, we unearth these roots again, a skull fragment here, a tooth there, and we remember that nothing human ever truly vanishes. It transforms. But perhaps most haunting is the question of identity. Did Homo erectus know they were fading? Did they notice the newcomers, more refined and strange? Did they feel that shift, not just in climate or resources, but in relevance? Did they look at other beings, shaped like them but not quite the same, and sense something changing in the hierarchy of the world? We'll never know, but it's not hard to imagine an aging member of their group watching a different kind of firelight glint off the stones, hearing different calls echo across the night, and wondering, not in words, but in feeling, whether their time was coming to an end. And yet, even in their last days, they didn't forget who they were. They kept using fire. They kept crafting tools. They kept walking, seeking, surviving. They didn't give up. There is nobility in that persistence, in refusing to vanish quietly, in holding to the rhythms that had carried them for millennia. And that endurance, more than any innovation, is what makes them unforgettable. The overlap of Homo erectus with other species raises fascinating questions not just about biology, but about what it means to be human. We often think of ourselves as the end point, the peak of evolution, but that's an illusion born of vanity. The truth is, we are the product of multiple species, blended across continents and centuries, molded by trial, chance, and choice. Homo erectus was not a stepping stone. They were a vital thread in the tapestry. Remove them, and the pattern collapses. Their interactions with other hominins weren't just incidental. They were catalytic, They nudged behaviors forward. They made the future possible. And in doing so, they ensured that no matter what name the future carried, Neanderthal, Denisovan, Sapiens, part of them would go on. So while they may not have painted caves or carved gods from stone, Homo erectus did something far more sacred. They gave us time. Time to evolve. Time to try again. Time to make the same mistakes they made. And hopefully, to learn from them. Their story reminds us that being human isn't about dominance or brilliance or beauty. It's about movement, memory, connection, and the courage to keep walking, even when the road ahead is uncertain. For tens of thousands of years, Homo erectus disappeared into silence. Their fires went out. Their tools were buried. Their footsteps vanished beneath shifting soils and rising seas. As the earth reshaped itself, their shelters crumbled into ruin, their bones calcified under pressure, and their legacy faded from the surface of the world. It wasn't until the modern age, when humans had built cities, charted maps, and begun to question their origins, that Homo erectus re-emerged. Not in flesh and blood, but in stone and fossil, in hints and fragments. In the deep, echoing spaces of forgotten caves and ancient rivers where their story had patiently waited, preserved in silence. The first real encounter with Homo erectus in modern science didn't come with fanfare. In fact, it came with confusion, controversy, and skepticism. In the 1890s, a physician turned anatomist named Eugène Dubois set out from Europe not to study apes or Neanderthals, but to find the elusive missing link between man and ape. His journey took him to the humid lowlands of Java, Indonesia, where he unearthed a skull cap and a femur that didn't quite match anything known at the time. The brain case was smaller than a modern human's but larger than an ape's. The thigh bone, however, suggested upright walking, fully bipedal. He called it Pithecanthropus erectus, upright ape man. But the world wasn't ready to hear it. His discovery was met with resistance. Colleagues called it a mistake, a hoax, or simply irrelevant. The scientific establishment of the day was still tangled in debates about evolution, many of which were more philosophical than empirical. The idea that there could be an ancient ancestor, walking tall but thinking differently, didn't fit cleanly into anyone's narrative. It would take decades before the name Homo erectus was fully accepted, and even longer for the species to be recognized as one of the most important players in our evolutionary history. But once the search began in earnest, it couldn't be stopped. Sites began to appear across Africa, Asia, and parts of Europe, each revealing a slightly different shade of Homo erectus. Taller here, shorter there, broader jaws in one region, more delicate skulls in another. It became clear that we weren't dealing with a single uniform group, but a wide-ranging, adaptable, incredibly resilient species that had held the evolutionary stage far longer than most of its successors. And the more we found, the more remarkable their story became. In Kenya's Lake Turkana Basin, nearly complete skeletons revealed strong bodies and surprising height. Adolescents approaching 6 feet tall, with rib cages and limb proportions built for endurance and heat regulation. In Dmanisi, Georgia, a series of skulls showed a strange blend of traits, some primitive, others surprisingly advanced, all from a time when Europe was thought to be uninhabitable by early humans. And in the hills of China, at sites like Zhoukoudian, evidence of sustained occupation and fire use painted a picture of a people who had not just visited cold regions but had lived in them, adapted to them, and made them home. These finds weren't just curiosities. They were puzzle pieces, rough, worn, but vital, in the picture of human origin. And each time a new fragment was unearthed, it forced science to reevaluate its assumptions. Because Homo erectus wasn't a footnote. They were a foundation. Their presence meant that the human story was not linear or simple. It was branching, overlapping, and deeply layered. And it started far earlier than many had assumed. One of the most astonishing revelations came not from bone, but from behavior. The tools, the fire pits, the migration routes, the way different populations adapted their methods to local conditions. These were not mindless brutes. They were intelligent, observant, and capable of innovation. And their innovations lasted. Some of the Herculean tools remained unchanged for nearly 1,000,000 years. That kind of technological consistency speaks not to stagnation, but to perfection. They had created something that worked, and they saw no need to replace it until something demonstrably better came along. That's not failure. That's functional intelligence. And still, despite all this, Homo erectus remained in the shadow of their more dramatic cousins. Neanderthals, with their huge brains and cave art, got the attention. Denisovans, with their mysterious genetics and high-altitude adaptations, sparked headlines. But Homo erectus? They remained quiet giants in the background, the ones who built the first roads but didn't name them, who started the fire but didn't write the recipe. Yet, without them, the others might not have existed at all. In recent years, that perception has begun to shift. New dating techniques, more refined analysis, and deeper genetic studies have all elevated Homo erectus from evolutionary stepping stone to cultural cornerstone. Their role is now seen as pivotal, not peripheral. They were the first to walk far and wide, the first to master fire, the first to settle and return to known places. They were the first to demonstrate what it truly meant to be human. Not in the modern sense of language or architecture, but in the deeper sense of resilience, adaptability, and connection. And as their image continues to sharpen through science, so too does their relevance. In a world grappling with climate shifts, migration pressures, and questions of cultural survival, Homo erectus offers a powerful reminder that humans are not just thinkers. We are doers, movers, survivors. We are problem solvers shaped by millions of years of hardship, trial, and movement. And the species that taught us how to start that journey, that lit the first fires and took the first steps into the unknown, was Homo erectus. They didn't leave behind towering temples or written scrolls. Their monuments are older, a symmetrical tool left beside an extinct elephant's bones, a hearth layered with ash in a cold mountain cave, a healed femur, proof that even the injured were not forgotten. These are their signatures, not written in ink but in action. And in finding them, in reading those silent messages, we don't just learn about the past. We remember who we are. If there's one lesson to take from Homo erectus, it's this. Extinction is not the same as disappearance. They are gone, yes. Their bodies no longer walk the forests of Java or the plains of Africa. Their voices no longer echo in the wind, and their fire no longer warms the mouths of ancient caves. But they never truly vanished. Their story didn't stop when their last population flickered out on some remote island coast. It continued. In us, in our bodies, in our instincts, in our shared memory of persistence. Every generation that has walked upright, solved a problem, adapted to crisis, or cared for another in need, knowingly or not, has carried the imprint of Homo erectus. They don't haunt us like ghosts. They empower us like ancestors. What they left us was more than bones and blades. They gave us structure, endurance, a foundation of behavior and decision-making that we still draw from today, even if we no longer recognize its origin. We inherited their curiosity, that unshakable desire to see what's beyond the next hill. We inherited their resilience, the strength to endure brokenness and continue forward. We inherited their social mind, the sense that life is better when it's lived with others. And maybe most importantly, we inherited their silence, not in a lack of intelligence, but in a quiet strength. They didn't shout their success. They didn't write their names in stone. They just did the work, generation after generation, step by step, fire to fire, home to home. Look around you now, at the cities that pulse with life, at the satellites circling the planet, at the digital world built from code, memory, and imagination. None of it would exist without the foundation built by those first upright walkers, the ones who didn't have language but communicated, who didn't have maps but moved, who didn't have laws but still knew to care. That's the beauty of Homo erectus. They didn't tell us who to be. They showed us how to become. We are the result of their patience, of their repetition, of their refusal to give up when the nights were cold and the paths were uncertain. Every time you face hardship and keep going, That's them. Every time you learn something by watching instead of speaking, that's them. Every time you help someone not because you have to, but because it feels right, that's them. Their legacy is not behind us. It walks beside us. And now as we close this journey together, I want to invite you into a kind of modern tribe. This community right here on this channel. If this video lit a fire in you, if you felt that strange tug of connection to a story 1.8 million years in the making, then I want you to subscribe. Not out of obligation, but out of shared wonder. Hit that button because you want to keep exploring the stories that shaped us, because you believe there's power in looking backward before we move forward. And I want to hear from you. What part of Homo erectus' story surprised you the most? What did you learn? And most importantly, what does their legacy mean to you right now, in this moment of your life? Maybe you've faced hardship and kept going, just like they did. Maybe you've helped someone get through something painful. Maybe you've carried a weight you didn't think you could bear, and survived. Share that. Tell us. This isn't just a video. It's a fire, and everyone here is welcome to sit around it. Your story matters. Your voice adds to theirs. Leave a comment. Share this video with someone who loves the hidden side of history. And when you look up at the stars tonight, or even just at your own reflection, remember this. You are not alone in time. You are part of a chain so old, so unbroken, so deeply human that it stretches beyond memory. And one of the strongest links in that chain was forged by Homo erectus. Silent, powerful, enduring. Thank you for being part of this journey. I'll see you in the next story.